This is me with the manager of the largest Austrian tank collection, and we're about to look at the first tank in the entire world. And I'm gonna find out if this metal box can actually qualify as a tank, or if it's just one of the many forgotten prototypes in history. But first of all, we need to clarify one question. What exactly is a tank? According to modern standards, tanks are tracked armored fighting vehicles with a cannon in the turret, and every country wants to have the best one. However, it wasn't always a battle between tank engineers to have the newest type of armor or the next-gen APFSDS round. Back then, the main goal was survival and firepower on the battlefield. But where and when did it all start? This question made me extremely curious about the origin of the tank. Initially, my research was about to send me to England with the famous Mark I, or France with its advanced Renault FT for its time. But as I dug deeper, I found some traces of the tank in a city none other than the capital of classical music, Vienna, Austria. Upon reading this, I quickly packed my bags and traveled to the famous tank hall in Vienna. Not only did I find out about the amazing history of the Austrian Armed Forces, but also found one of the earliest examples of the tank.
This right next to me is the first ever Austrian armored vehicle. This is the Saurer IFV. During the war they used the German Sonderkraftfahrzeug Saurer IFV, the SDKFZ 251, and they weren't happy with that. It had poor mobility and poor armament, and well, poor armor, so well, they really weren't happy with that. Thankfully, after the war, the Americans were so kind and lended them the M3 half-track. And well, that kind of set the mood back on track, and they began developing something for their own needs. The requirements were a fast, mobile, well-armored from armor steel, and well, reliable IFV. So, they started developing. Thankfully, they had a lot of things to work with, because after the war, they had the Soviet T-34s, they had the American Chaffees, they had the British Charioteers, and they had the French AMX-13. And their plan was to combine the best parts of all of these tanks into a single one. While armor steel was desperately needed because all the other ones were just aluminium and there was a lot of shrapnel, and armor steel kind of prevented that, so that was their requirements. So they started developing. The order was given to Saurer Productions, and just a year later they revealed their very first prototype of a Saurer IFV. Unfortunately enough, it really represented the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251. It looked a lot like it, and then they started developing another one. The back door got lowered, the top section got closed, so they can't be well attacked by aircraft fire. The section was closed, they had a different engine, and well, they had a better suspension and overall a better design. So we ended up with the Saurer IFV. They had the first prototype, that was the 4KH I think. They were happy with the new IFV, and well, all the other countries started noticing Austria's development. Even the German IFV leading tank engineers back then said the Austrians have one of the most advanced IFVs for that time. Take the M113 from America, for example. In comparison to that thing, the M113 is just an aluminium can that can withstand basically to nothing enemy attacks. But this thing got advanced, and well, it was used in such a variety. For example, the one you have right next to me is the one with the 20mm autocannon. They had, well, other for, just transporting stuff. They had reconnaissance vehicles with radio stations and radio transmitters. They had, well, ambulance vehicles so they can just help the people on the field. And it was used in a lot of different ways. And actually, it was so popular that just the last Saurer retired from the Austrian army just a couple of years back. It was so popular. But is that really the end of the story of the Saurer? Behind me, you have the first all-Austrian tank. Back in 1962, Austria decided that we need our own tank, because most of the tanks consisted of American and Soviet vehicles, but they weren't happy with that. So what they thought to themselves, we need a tank. Fortunately, they had a lot of Saurer hulls laying around in the factories from the Saurer I talked about earlier. So what did? They put the Saurer hull, and then it was suggested to put the AMX-13 105 turret on top of it and call it a day. That didn't quite work out, really, because as they put the turret on the Saurer hull, the Saurer just tilted backwards, because the absolute colossal turret of an AMX-13, which weighed around 6 tons, just was too heavy. And well, was this center because the engine was in the middle of the Saurer hull. So they designed it a bit different. They made the hull longer, the chassis longer. They put the engine in the back, and now, ladies and gentlemen, they have place for a turret in the middle. Very nice. So they put the MX-13 turrets on there, the 105mm, and we're happy. We have an Austrian tank. Around 115 of these were built until they realized, wait a minute, this isn't actually all Austrian, is it now, with a French turret? We need something different. So they started developing something in 1972. They started developing two turrets, the Fürst 1 and the Fürst 2. As you can see, they're closely resembling the AMX-13 turrets, but they're just a bit different. Unlike the AMX turrets, the AMX turrets were casted, by the way, this one is welded. It is better armored, it has more space for the crew, but overall it kept the real design. Well, you gotta give the French designers credit where credit is due, because they kept the oscillating turret design and the drums in the back of the turret, because, let's be honest, they were amazing. Oh, and also props to the designer, because he actually put two storage bins at the end of the turret, so, well, their crew can store something, unlike on some other tanks. But eventually they realized this isn't quite what they needed. So it wasn't as strong as they intended it to be. So they made a couple of changes. After they built around 284 of the Kürassier A2 and A1s, they took 115 of them and fitted them with an automatic transmission, making them a lot better. Not only did they do that, but they added a muzzle brake at the end of the barrel, allowing them to finally fire APF-SDS sabots, making the Kürassier joining the ranks of the Soviet and American vehicles at that time. This was the real deal. It was fitted with a laser rangefinder and, well, light, so you can, well, fight night battles. This particular vehicle right behind me was used during the Yugoslavian War in 1991 during summer at the border to Yugoslavia at the Karavanken-tunnel. This vehicle was tasked to overlook the border and prevent anyone from entering Austria, and this one stood right there next to the tunnel, fully loaded, ready for combat. If I say the word or the words World War I tank, what do you see? Some of you might think of the British Mark I or the French FT-17. Now, if you're a real tank connoisseur, you might even say the A7V from Germany. But did you know there's one fourth design that has been forgotten by history? Let me introduce you to the Burstyn tank, or the Burstyn-Motorgeschütz. This was invented by Günther Burstyn in 1911. Now, he just came to this idea just by very chance. Let me tell you how. Günther Burstyn was very keen on inventing a so-called land torpedo boat, or a, well, torpedo boat that can drive on land. That was when he got a ride on the SMS land torpedo boat, I think it was 18. So after that, his idea was, I need to develop something like a land torpedo boat that can drive on terrain. So he started researching about the latest armed conflict, the Russo-Japanese War, which ended in 1995. So after he developed that, he noticed something, that the newest warfare was based on trenches and artillery and, well, gunfire. So he wanted to have something that can cross trenches and be protected from gunfire. So what he did, he, well, essentially developed what we have here. Another key part was when he visited a car exhibition in Vienna in 1905, where he saw an Austro-Daimler car, an armored car, and he was very fascinated by something armored but mobile. But he was very worried that an armored car would be bound to roads and have terrible, terrible mobility on terrain. So he looked at the agriculture vehicles, like tractors, for example, and noticed the tracks. They have excellent grip and have perfect mobility on terrain. So he combined these two and came up with what we have here. Now you might notice these arms in the front, which are, well, retractable supports for crossing trenches. But in order to actually activate them, you have to get to a full stop and then put them down, drive over the trench, and if you want to, retract them again during a full stop. He was very, well, happy with this idea, and then he went to the, well, war ministry in Austria, and then they said, we don't like your design, it's basically like a toy. And, well, they rejected him. So he tried again in Germany. He got rejected twice. So there he was, Günther Burstyn, with his Burstyn-Motorgeschütz, and, well, nobody, well, wanted his design. But he didn't give up yet. In 1912, he went to the patent office and requested a patent for his Motorgeschütz. But unfortunately, he only got, well, a patent for the retractable arms to the front because all the other ones, like the turret or an armored, well, fighting compartment, have already been claimed. And so eventually, not a lot of people know about the Burstyn-Motorgeschütz, and I think it's important to talk about it because, well, actually this is the base for tanks because the FD-17, well, it had a rotatable turret. This tank, well, had a rotatable turret but not 360 degrees. Another interesting thing that I've been told today while I was shooting, that we actually don't know whether the front side is this or this, because it was never stated where the driver sat. There was only, in the documents, there was a driver. It has been especially, well, described what the loader, what the gunner does, what the commander does, but not what the driver does or where he sits. So we don't know if the gun was facing to the side, to the back, and then you can look left and right during the trenches and shoot, or it was looking in the front. We never know. So that's the Burstyn-Motorgeschütz. I think is very interesting. So let's head to the next one. Not gonna lie to you guys, I'm feeling pretty safe inside of this tank. Now, well, it was made to protect you from enemy threats and enemy shells in the first place to keep you safe and secure. But what if I told you there was something that can simulate the safety of inside a tank for your online browsing? Now see, recently I've partnered with NordVPN, this is my new partner, and well, this is a safety service that hides your IP address, just like a camouflage, and basically blocks out all malware, ads, and well, trackers. This is great. And not only does it hide your IP address, but it also masks your location, which means that you can connect to basically over 60 countries and over 5,500 servers plus, with popular regions like Japan, the United States, the UK, Germany, and all of the other countries that you want. There's something in your country you can't watch on Netflix, boom, one click, you connect to another VPN, you can watch it, no problem. So, if you want to support the channel, please click the link, my affiliate link in the description down below or on screen right now for a huge discount. Trust me, it's worth. Now let's get back to record some tanks, shall we? This thing behind me, this piece of metal, might just be one of the most interesting exhibits in this museum. Now you might think this is just an ordinary Sherman, an M4A1, but I wouldn't agree, because this is actually an M4A1 Grizzly built by Canada. Now, how do I tell apart that this is not a regular M4A1 but a Grizzly? Well, the only thing you need to look at is the front sprocket, because the front sprocket had 17 teeth instead of 13 on the regular Sherman. But let's start with production first. This particular Sherman was built in 1943 in Canada as one of the 188 ever built, and this is one of them that survives until this very day. And after that, it got sent to the UK for probably taking part in the Mediterranean theater, but we don't know that yet. So, what happened? This got shipped to the UK. You might have noticed this one capital letter G in the front, but let me tell you, unfortunately, it does not stand for Grizzly, but it stands for where the hull has been casted. It has been casted in Granite City, Illinois. So after it has been shipped, it then sat there, and eventually the Second World War ended. And just around the time NATO started forming, 55 of these Grizzlies has been sent to Portugal in 1954 for, well, service. And then they served all the way up to the 1980s, where they eventually retired because they got too old. So they got transported back to the UK, to be specific, to Wales, because Ian McGregor bought a couple of M4A1 Grizzlies just to sell them to the, well, army in South Wales and Sennybridge for the wars, because after that they were used as hard targets and, well, they were shot at. This Sherman had the number 25 on its side. Eventually, Bovington took notice and they said, wow, we have such a rare tank there, but that's getting shot at constantly. Why don't we buy it and recover it? So in 1985, Bovington arrived at the field and recovered the M4A1 Grizzly. They did a perfect job in restoring it, well, on the outside, because the inside is pretty roughed up, but then they painted it in the famous colors of the Sherman Cricklead. This was an honor for this very famous photograph, but they just used the camouflage and then they called it Wilton to be original. So after it was named Wilton, they eventually decided to, well, paint it again in the same camouflage as Cricklead, but this time actually call it Cricklead because this was very famous as a gate guard of, well, the Bovington Tank Museum, the biggest tank museum in the world. So it stood there, but not for long. It stood there for 1 year. After that, it was, well, repainted again in this beautiful green color and was called T224878 as an ID number. So it stood there as a gate guard, right next to the famous and very big FV4005, and for, well, a lot of years. Up until, well, just recently, where this tank was rented to the Vienna Tank Museum here in this beautiful location in a very festive, well, manner. And since then, it's displayed here for everyone to look at, to see at, and, well, to explore. And I really recommend you come here and just take a look at this rare piece of history right here. On to the next one. You might recognize this thing from my recent Technikmuseum Sinsheim video. This is a Jagdpanzer 38T Hetzer. Now, the T in the name is actually for Czechoslovakia or Czechoslovakia in German, but don't be fooled by its appearance yet, because this is no ordinary Hetzer. Actually, this is a Swiss G13. Well, you might ask yourself, well, but that's not a G13. The G13 has a different gun and a muzzle brake. Let's start off by its history, so you don't get confused. This tank was built in 1945 in Prague by Skoda and then was, well, shipped out. We have no records of its World War II service, but I doubt it really served. After that, it got sold to Switzerland, and after the war, I think it was in June. And after that, they just used it, they converted it to a G13, they changed a bit of the front parts, they added a muzzle brake, replaced the old gun with a Stuck 40, and after that, well, it served until 1972. In 1972, eventually it retired because it was, well, old, unreliable, you had different standards for the time back then, and they decided to, well, give out their G13s to different museums all around the world, and this one arrived in Vienna. After that, it was stored in a storage hall and just sat there all alone until eventually was started restoring in 2005. And thankfully, the restoration has been done very beautifully. It has been painted in its original colors. It has the number 221 on its side. And in 2009, it had its first appearance, and it continues to impress, well, visitors from the Panzerhalle to this very day, because this, well, is a very special and very interesting exhibit. But there was a lot of history talk, so why don't we head inside?
As I was climbing inside the Hetzer, it made me realize just how hard it must have been to climb inside or outside the tank during battle conditions, when back then you only had a handful of seconds to get to safety. On another note, the little stairs were quite a handy feature.
What's special about this Hetzer, or any Hetzer in particular, is that it was the first tank destroyer with a machine gun on top, which you can operate from inside a tank. For this tank, it was the MG34. On other tanks you had different ones, but unlike on the Stuks, you had a, well, machine gun on top, which you can operate from the inside, which is very great, unlike on the other tanks. But overall, a pretty amazing thing, don't you think?
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, you can continue watching the next one or subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye.